Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the Paula Kantor seminar. Thank you very much for joining, for your interest. This is the last event of the year 2025. So thank you for being with us. And thank you also to Katharina Schiller, who's here with us, presenting her work on inclusive and responsible scaling in agricultural research for development. Most of you probably know Katharina. She's a SIM integrated expert, working here based in Texcoco, HQ. And I think you joined CIMMYT like 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, roundabout. Still enjoying your time with CIMMYT, like all of us. So thank you very much, Katharina. The format is always like half an hour presentation, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. And everyone in the audience, if you should have a question during the presentation, feel also free to use the chat or just wait for the discussion afterwards. We should have enough time. Okay, thank you very much again, everyone. Thanks, Katharina, and I'll hand it over to you for your presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michael. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity to be presenting today as part of the Paula Kantor Center Seminar Series. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining. As Michael said, yeah, I'm Katharina Schiller. I'm here in CIMMYT, based in Texcoco in Mexico. And my main work is to support other CIMMYT scientists and CIMMYT programs in scaling. And so I wanted to talk today, especially thinking of the Paula Kantor, of the Paula Kantor Center, of the also gender and inclusivity work that CIMMYT does. And yes, I wanted to talk today about inclusive and responsible scaling in AR4D, of course, with a focus on our work here at CIMMYT. So I'll just briefly be going over, I mean, I know that all of you have heard the word scaling. I know everyone uses it. I think it's very overused, right? So we'll go briefly over what actually is an innovation, what's scaling, should every innovation scale, and then what is inclusive and responsible scaling, and just briefly looking at the tools that we have here in the CG, and especially at CIMMYT, that are inclusive and responsible to help you scale. So thinking of what do we scale in AR4D? Well, I mean, everyone knows we scale innovations, right? Innovation is very important. The premise is, right, to bring a food system change towards sustainability. And what's often not thought about or not mentioned as well is that an innovation is something new, right? Or something old that's being repurposed as something new. And an innovation always comes together with knowledge. It always comes with some kind of new insights, knowledge of some type. And so when we scale, when we talk about scaling, I think oftentimes we think immediately about the innovations, about the tech, about the new seed, about the new a new way of mechanizing it, of whatever, of the hard innovation. But we also have to think at the same time of all the knowledge and all the other soft innovations that go around this, which is the point that I wanted to make here. So we also have, like I was just saying, there's lots of different types of innovations, right? So we have technological innovations that we're all very familiar with. So new or improved or improved traditional ways of doing things. We have institutional innovations, so changes in norms, regulation, policy frameworks. Social innovation, of course, very important, I think, also in agri-food, so changes in social practices or new forms of organizing together socially. We have business model innovation, so new forms of creating or capturing value, also super important, of course, and cultural or symbolic innovations that are changes in values or social narratives that can probably take a long time to foment, but are definitely type of newness there. We also always have to think, of course, do we have one innovation? I think we often also tend to talk about innovations as if they're one thing and monolithic. But usually we don't just have an innovation, we have an innovation bundle, right? And we have to scale maybe not just one part of it, but several different things, which of course raises the complexity even more. So I think one of the basic issues of scaling has been in the past, let's say 50, 60 years, that scaling has been thought of as a linear process, right? So we have an innovation, be it social, technological, process innovation, whatever, some kind of innovation. We have a proof of concept, right? It works great, shows great promise. Then we pilot, still under semi-constrained, not constrained, guided uh, in a semi-guided concept, right? And it works great in the piloting as well. And then we scale, of course, and everyone magically uses this innovation and it's a success and it brings social benefits, let's say environmental benefits, economic benefits, all of the benefits. And we know, of course, again, from our 60 years of practice, or also from your own work, I'm sure, that this it doesn't really happen that way a lot of the time, right? So scaling is the vast majority of projects are not scaled up to have a greater impact, and the vast majority of projects disappear after the initial funding ends. And this graph is from a project adoption in Honduras in the 80s and 90s, and we see. I'm sure you've all seen this, is experienced this in your work as well, right? That it sounds like a great idea, it's great, but then the pilot works great, but then we don't actually scale up after the project ends. And also, there's no more funding to look for impact then, right? To actually measure that impact. So we have a couple of different problems going on here when we say that pilots never fail, pilots never scale. Big problem, basic problem is, of course, that linear thinking in our complex, complicated, interrelated world is really, really difficult. I mean, it's great to do linear thinking. I don't know how useful it is to be applied, right? So this whole timeline of innovation to scale needs to be broken up. Well, it is in real life, right? We need different things happen, unexpected things happen, and how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that right from the beginning? That's the idea. So what we need is kind of a systems approach, right? We have these wicked problems. I'm sure a term everyone here is familiar with. So wicked problems that don't have just one solution, that don't touch maybe just one system, but that are very interconnected, um, that are multidimensional, that require a lot of different approaches to address. And so systems thinking, system aware approaches really help to to make an integrated problem analysis. They help in defining a participatory priority setting, and they help in co-designing and co-implementing these projects so that they actually achieve the impact that we want to have. And the idea is that system approaches will address these issues in a linear idea of innovation, right? Because we know that innovation is not actually a linear process. We know that it's also an iterative process. We know that it also requires adaptive management constantly, right? And it can create tension in the actual linear system approaches that are also that also define how we work and how we can work. And I'm talking not just about on the field, but also in our administrative setups and the whole way in which programs are run. So thinking about scaling, we also have different types of scaling. And I think scaling is often scaling out. When we say the word scaling, I think we often think of scaling out. So reaching more people, multiplying the same technology over greater areas, more. So extension, replication of the innovation that we have. However, oh, pardon, we also have, of course, scaling up. So this is actually integrating this new innovation in policy, in different ways of interacting. So changing at a higher scale the framework conditions for this innovation. And then we have a third type of scaling, pardon me again, which is often not really addressed or not thought about, and really, 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 really hard to address, of course, with short project timelines that we all work with. But scaling deep, so shifting mindsets or values or practices actually in society, which are, of course, usually, multi-generational processes that take a lot longer than our 3 to 5 year project timelines that we often work under. So I wanted to present these three types of scaling to see, well, to show that when we say scaling, oftentimes the word is used when one of these, or maybe several of these, a combination of these is used, is meant, but it's not really clearly defined what we mean when we say we want to scale. Also, really important point, not everything has to scale up, right? So sometimes when we scale things up, we have to scale other things down that are unsustainable. And so here for the example is conservation agriculture, right? Um, or from tillage to no tillage. So we have to, and it shows this X curve that we need to break down as well the tilling practices or the unsustainable practices if we want to scale up these sustainable practices. And this figure here, it's called the X curve, and it's a very famous curve for showing these kinds of processes that need to happen at the same time. And this is something that is often not talked about, right? That's definitely kind of when we want to scale something up, we don't talk about the fact that we also need to break patterns and scale other things down, but also really important to do. Should every innovation scale? I think history has clearly shown us that scaling without foresight can lead to grave harms, can lead to social inequalities, can lead to great environmental harm, and of course, loss of trust between you and your project partners. They can generate or exacerbate these inequalities. And scaling, if we're not careful, scaling can also reinforce unequal status quos or limit the profundity of change that we can actually impulse if we stick to the same old patterns that we've been sticking in our scaling processes. So we have a couple of examples of unsustainable inventions or innovations here that tried to scale and just didn't hit the spot that I'm going to talk about really quickly. The first one right now is the case of potato drying equipment in Peru, which basically in the Peru and Andes about maybe 10 years ago or so, it was decided to introduce, well, it was seen that an issue was that the potatoes didn't dry fast enough, or it was thought that, okay, this is something that we can help with a solar oven, right? It's a hard work. It's led by women. It's in the high Andes. And so these solar ovens, solar drying mechanisms were made and were purchased and were put into this town or this in the Andean Highlands. I'm not sure exactly where in the Andean Highlands it was, but it's piloted in several villages, and it wasn't used. And at the end of the day, what happened was that yeah, potato drying was a hard part, but potato peeling was the actual really hard part that women needed help with. But nobody had asked them. And so scientists had seen, oh, that's the part that they had seen had been, oh, the drying is the hard part. They hadn't actually witnessed the peeling also being a hard part. And so this was clear, I think, a classic example of really well-meaning intentions of people coming in and seeing what they think is a problem, but defining this problem from their complete outside perspective and not taking into account not asking the people who are actually involved and who are actually using these equipments. And so what happened here in Peru was that it turned out at the end of the day that, like I said, women wanted help with the peeling, not with the drying. And so they said the sun can dry this just as fast as this oven, and I don't need to buy this other tool to do this. And so it just didn't work. It didn't scale, and it led to a lot of people feeling discounted. There, women, half of the society feeling like they weren't taken into account, which they clearly weren't, and just completely off the mark. A great idea, but a lot of money wasted with something that was not useful in the area that it was trying to be in, or supposed to be in. The second example, we will stay with the potato here, is about a potato harvester that was put into a project in Bolivia, was introduced. So the single row potato harvester to make the harvesting of potatoes, again, also a very high labor activity, to make the harvesting of potatoes a little easier. But the problem was that this harvester was not adapted, this time not to the social conditions, but it was not adapted to the physical conditions. So it worked, but it only worked on loamy soils, not on stony ones. But in this area of the Andes, we have particularly stony soils. So it didn't work either. And I think these are two very nice examples that just show, if we don't pay attention to what we're doing, we can really create problems and just waste a lot of resources and not be efficient and impactful in our work. So what is inclusive scaling? I really like this definition here in the middle. So, which says that inclusive scaling can be seen, well, if we think about scaling not as a way to increase the numbers of people that are using something, but to include the people who have previously been excluded. And I like that definition. I like that mental image of scaling as a way to include everybody. And so inclusive scaling is a process to ensure that marginalized groups that whose voices were not taken into account are not excluded from the benefits and from the decision making in scaling efforts. And this, of course, addresses these historical tendencies that we've had, especially in agricultural research for development, and of course, also in other sectors of scaling processes to give preferential voice to the already better connected people, right? The already maybe socially better connected, socially more wealthy actors, thereby exacerbating inequalities and risking the reinforcement of existing power imbalances. Responsible scaling is another term, so they sound kind of the same. And when I first started looking into this, I was like, oh, inclusive scaling, responsible scaling, that must be kind of similar. When you actually look into the literature, responsible scaling goes way beyond inclusive scaling. And it emphasizes that scaling does not only have to be equitable, right, but also ethically sound, environmentally sustainable, and socially accountable. And it comes from this broader responsible research and innovation movement, which really foregrounds these ideas of anticipation, reflexivity, inclusion, responsivity in scaling processes. This responsible research and innovation movement has been very picking up speed in Europe in the last, I would say, maybe 10, 15 years. People have been working a lot on this, like what is responsible innovation to avoid exactly these inequitable problems that I was talking about before. And so responsible scaling, I really like this quote down here at the bottom. So we can think about it as caring for the future through the collective management of science and innovation in the present. And so, yeah, we want to think about really, so bringing everybody in really, right, anticipating a lot of these, um, not just ethical, not just social, but also environmental effects that we can have of innovations from the get-go. How do we do this? Always the big question. How do we do this? Well, we can scale responsibly. One option is, a very big option is by taking a relational approach. And that means that we understand that we are always working within a web of stakeholders. We are working with people within this web with people that we have worked with people that we have not worked with before, and in an environmental context as well, where there have been projects before and there will be projects after. So we see ourselves in a continual relational timeline to the people in our context, also before and after. This is what I mean by taking a relational approach, just quickly. How do we do this? So, number one, we need an early vision. We need to integrate scaling right from the get-go. We need to define scaling objectives and strategies from the beginning and with everybody involved, which is point number two, co-creation. We need to have all of the different stakeholders at the table, even people that maybe we think are not important right now, but maybe will be in the future. And we need to co-design these scaling pathways jointly with them, and not just for one scale. If we're thinking about maybe, in our municipality, or we can touch maybe 50 farms, but then what does that mean if we scale this up to, let's say, state level, right? How many, if we have 50,000 farms, what would that then mean? Could there be other environmental or social or financial, negative aspects that we can identify now? Number three, through this anticipatory action. So we identify social and environmental risks. How? Through networks. This is why it's so important to have everybody at the table, even those that you think maybe don't need to be there. We need to create, and we need everybody here. We need to be talking about this thing. So all together, also including policymakers, including everybody, including academics, to create this enabling environment, right? To really leverage the network, to leverage the resources of the network, or to have the network as such be a resource to improve our policies, our markets, the whole general picture, the context in which we are working. We need from the get-go, we need adaptive management. Point number five, we need feedback loops for learning and for and that enable rapid response and adjustment when the situation shifts, which you probably will at some point in time. And it's really great to have moving into point 6, these multi-directionally linked pathways. So not just, I mean, the question is also, do we as CIMMYT have to scale, or can others scale? Can we just provide the backdrop? Can we provide the the capacity building? Can we provide the connections? But then other organizations, other people actually do the scaling work. Can we connect those actors to scale on all 3 levels, to scale out, up, and deep, right? And number 7, really important also, this active relation building. So anchoring innovations into the existing networks for lasting impact over time. Again, not necessarily driven by us, right? But innovations can go and have a life of their own as well. So these 7 points taken together are this relational scaling approach that we are currently working on profundizing, on deepening even more. But these are the first 7 points that we believe, or that we have seen, that have come out of our work to be really, really, really important, to be centrally important in creating scaling processes that are effective over time. Within the CG, we have, so I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, there was a seminar by a CG consultant, Helen Altschul, who did a study of the inclusive and responsible innovation in the CG. And she did this, she found, well, she did a whole analysis, and she found that really within, we do have some great tools already developed that are responsible, not just responsible innovation, but also respond to what she calls responsible scaling. And we see that these 3 that are circled here, so gender up, the scaling scan, and innovation package and scaling readiness, have a strong and explicit inclusion of responsible innovation and responsible scaling subjects. And I highly recommend this framework analysis report. It's, if you want to get more into this, it's available on CG Space. It's a really interesting read. But I was really happy to see that these tools that we have directly within the CG, and especially directly within CIMMYT. So the scaling scan, was developed by CIMMYT and partners. And it's available online. It was especially cited by Helen Altschul as being especially inclusive and especially responsible. So I strongly urge you to check it out. There is, for IPSR, of course, and Gender Up, there are trainings available. For the scaling scan, there is also training available on the CIMMYT Academy website. But you're also more than happy, or more than, you're always invited to do it yourself, the scaling scan, because it's available just on the website, scalingscan.org. And there's a couple different, I think there's 3 different versions on the website, and the short version is really, I think it's a great resource for everybody to use, that's really easy to use and really helps you think through some of these responsible and inclusive issues that I mentioned earlier. So, and this is because when you do the scaling scan, so first of all, you define a scaling ambition, which already helps you. There's 5 or 6 questions in the website that help you, that help lead you through what is a scaling ambition, and how you define that, like key questions, guiding questions. But then number 2, really this part here, assessing the 10 scaling ingredients, I think is a really, there's also guiding questions on the website as you go through these. And I think that this can be really, really, really helpful to forward think to, and especially when if you do the scaling scan, for example, with a couple of different stakeholders, everyone always has different answers. And I think it can be a really useful tool to help you think through all these things and anticipate them from the get-go, really from the beginning of the project stand. So I hope that you will use these tools, especially the ones that we have here in CIMMYT, again, to do your responsible scaling, to do your inclusive scaling. And thank you for your interest today. I look forward to your questions. Michael, your microphone is still off.
Sorry now. Thank you so much, Katharina, for your presentation. I was saying it's a very nice presentation, very comprehensive overview, I think, of what it is to scale sustainably and responsibly, and also some nice examples like what happens if you don't consider certain elements. And of course, also very helpful, the links to these existing tools in the CG space. Yeah. So colleagues, please, if you have any questions, comments, doubts, go ahead. You can unmute yourself or raise your hand maybe, or you can also use the chat if you can't speak or if you don't want to speak. Odette, do you want me to read it out, or can you unmute yourself?
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I have a question. It's related to the youth. Considering the aging of the rural population in many regions, what are the biggest challenges faced by agricultural scaling models to attract, retain, and capitalize on the potential of rural youth? Thank you, Katarina, for your excellent presentation.
Thank you, Odette, for your question.
It's also in the chat, the question, if you didn't catch everything. It's also there in the chat.
Okay. Wait, maybe if I stop sharing my screen, then I can see or should I share my screen still?
No, it's okay. You can stop here.
Okay.
We can see the people. Okay, thank you.
I think that for youth especially, I mean, I think well, based on my experience mostly in Central America this year, I would say that youth see that they're being disenfranchised in agriculture, right? They see very little opportunities for the future, and that includes, and they see larger opportunities in other fields. So I think that's a communication problem, but B also I mean, we really, really need to take that seriously. And I think how we can take that seriously is through showing young people that there is a future in agriculture and the importance, not just the cultural importance, but also, of course, the financial importance and um, the impact that agriculture can still have. However, I think this is also, especially with the youth, I mean, I think that's such a large cultural issue as well. And maybe here CIMMYT would have to do more, or could link more with more NGOs on the ground to promote youth and agriculture, to promote maybe agribusinesses as a way of, or different, also linking with gastronomy. For example, when I was working in Honduras this year, there was a strong interest in linking conservation agriculture, well, from the gastronomy side, so from restaurants, in not in Tegucigalpa, but in places off in the country, in villages, there was a strong interest from restaurants that we visited also to link with producers that had um, good food and also a steady supply. So I think, there's a lot to take advantage of that we can bring more youth into agriculture and hold more youth in the country as well, or in the rural countryside, should I say. And I think it involves, like I said, partnering more with institutions that are on the ground. They're not just NGOs, but also with other types of institutions and organizations to show people that agriculture is not just something you do because your parents did it, but it's something you do because you can make money at it and have a great life for your family. And that's, I think, a lot of times a more cultural issue.
Thank you very much. Jelle, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for not, sorry for not putting the camera. My hairdo is still in the morning style. So, but thank you, Katarina, for your presentation. I've listening through you, I've been remembering all the different frameworks that we had, and I'm often struggling with what CG calls the scaling readiness. What do you think about that, and how can we connect something like that to really measure a successful scaling exercise towards impact? No? How can we make that more tangible, more understandable for our community? Because that's often in that scaling readiness or innovation readiness, it's kind of fit in with the data that we have from those pilot projects, right? So how can we maybe take 2 steps back and then reframe that a bit to see, okay, this is something we've done, let's say conservation agriculture, no, and in this country it has scaled. How can we verify that in other areas, whether we're doing good or not? No, I know it's a complex question, no, but I think it's something that really keeps me thinking a lot. So thanks.
No, absolutely. Good morning. Yeah, and good morning to everybody in Mexico. I know it's early. Um, but I completely agree, and I think that this is generally an issue, of course, measuring impact. And if I may be quite frank, and well, scaling readiness was built based on, I mean, it comes from NASA, right? It was built based on a NASA framework. It is very technology focused. So I mean, in my presentation now, I talked about all kinds of other innovations besides the technological innovations. I think scaling readiness is focused on technological innovations, and I think that is a big drawback. And I'm speaking quite openly here now, so please don't come after me, anybody out there. But I think scaling readiness has, of course, a lot of positive points, but also is quite limited, like you said, in what it addresses. Also, because it was built on what's already there, it didn't really think outside the box. And what I think what we need to show impact. I mean, I am seeing working with the hubs in Mexico, I am seeing there is so much more impact than that is captured by eogrology or that is captured by the data that we have. Again, because this data is, and I think this is totally normal and totally fine, of course, based on historical precedent, our data is very hard facts, right? We don't really collect data on, oh, has there been a social change? Do the mothers in this village feel that, they have a more equal voice in the farming household? Things like that we don't really talk about so much, or we don't capture them, and when they do, it's in a separate box. It's under the gender box, it's under some other, but it's not within the scaling readiness within the big frames that we have in the CG. And I think to do that, we should to capture these other impacts, we can also use other frameworks. And I think back here to the work that I did last year in the hub meetings, where asked, where we used this idea of scaling and these different aspects of scaling to ask people in the hubs, what differences have you seen? So besides the innovations themselves, or besides making more money, or having a larger yield, what are other impacts that you've seen of the hub's work? And we really saw, and I just did this in 2 hub meetings last year in Chiapas and in Oaxaca, but people were so interested to talk about this, and they had so many things to say, and so many different aspects came out. Everything from that, going back to Odette's question, everything from, oh, as a young person, I feel like I have more capacities and my voice gets taken into account more by my father, to women saying, I feel like I have a stronger saying now because I know more, because I've learned on the parcela. Now I can also apply this, and my husband asked me for advice, and now we regulate things together. And a lot of that was coming out in these hub meetings last year. Really, I have like pages of data on this. And I think if we could figure out, well, I think this is a framework we could use, or we could, of course, make it much better, like make a much more detailed framework, but use that, go into the hubs and really ask these kind of questions, capture that data. In a way that scaling readiness, or the way that scaling readiness and also eogrology, like the tools that we have right now, don't really allow us to do, just because they're not so focused on the socio-institutional aspect so much.
Thank you
But
very
we can
much,
talk about this more, Yella. I'm very, very excited. We would be happy to talk about this more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katrina.
Thanks. There are 2 questions in the chat from Jonathan.
Jonathan?
Jonathan, do you want me to read them out? And can you speak? Or
Yeah, I could speak, but I'm not sure my internet is very stable. That's why I was trying to type. But
okay.
yeah, I think there are solicitations for comments, Katerina, if you don't mind. Yeah. One is
Please.
just about those 2 concepts, adoption, scaling. Your comment on what are the linkage, correlations, or overlaps on those 2 topics, because I see sometimes people mix them up a lot, even in the context of working in CIMMYT. Then the second one is just a question about where CIMMYT stands in terms of how equipped we are to implement responsible and inclusive scaling. Because, I mean, it requires definitely a bit of different stakeholders and skill sets in addition to inputs and perspectives. Yeah, I wanted to hear what you think about our standing in that, and if you have any examples of where, if you have any model projects that you think are really doing good job in terms of actually proper responsible scaling by the book, how it should be. Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for the questions. Considering scaling and adoption, I mean, yes, I think, of course, adoption here, if we think about the scaling pyramid, going back to that, right? Adoption is clearly part of scaling out. And I think adoption is just one part of scaling. And adoption is also not even, I mean, I think it's when you think of scaling, you say the word scaling, I think somebody automatically would think of adoption. However, I think as we know in our line of work, that it's not just adoption, it's also adaptation, right? Super, super important of an innovation to the local context, to whatever works best for the farmer. And so adoption, correlation, linkage between concepts of scaling and adoption. Adoption is one small part of scaling. But scaling involves not just adoption, but also adaptation to scale out. And then we also have to include these ideas of scaling up and scaling deep. So adoption is maybe let's say 1/6 of that. Then going on to your second question, the responsible various stakeholder skill sets and inputs. I think here, for example, I think CIMMYT's work in capacity building for other stakeholders, for our partners, is fantastic. Because like I said prior, we don't need to, maybe we don't need to do all of the heavy lifting and the scaling ourselves, but we can capacitate our partners in order to scale with them or through them, or that they actually are the main implementers here. And I see CIMMYT, I mean, most of my experience is in CIMMYT LATAM, so that might be different from your experience in CIMMYT in Africa or in Asia. But I feel like it's the idea is there, the willingness is there, it's starting to be implemented, right? I think we still have a way to go on this responsible and inclusive scaling, even though that's of course what we always want. But I also understand that how, like Yella said, we're in one of many cycles of scaling and of understanding scaling and how we do it. So I think that I see good work happening. I see good progress happening. In the context of CIMMYT, are we adequately positioned? And I don't really have any examples of a particular project right now to give you, though. Santiago, good morning. You have your hand raised. Is there a question?
Yeah, sorry. I'm struggling with this Zoom thing.
Yes.
Thanks, Katarina, for the presentation. Very interesting, and I hope it changes a bit the logic of not only CIMMYT, but the CGR and the research for development sphere. I discussed quite a lot the scaling scan with Leonard, and I always have two big questions around that, and maybe you have a better answer than Leonard had a few years ago. One is, normally we are talking about this social institutional or techno-institutional innovation bundles. No? So the example I was really surprised when I went, well, not surprised, when I went to Bangladesh, we were trying to intensify the crop livestock integration and the sustainability of the whole farm system. So it implied a better feeding strategy. So it was changing a bit, having some crop rotations with fodder crops, but it was also a lot about veterinary services. It was a lot about a cooperative for selling milk because it was a women's group. So then you had this, I don't remember how it's called, socio-technical innovation bundle. While the scaling scan, it always have an entry point in one innovation, mechanization, forage production, veterinary services, how do we, the different elements are in place for the veterinary services or for the fodder production or for the refrigerator and the selling and the organization of the cooperative and all that. So how do we do the scaling scan when we want to do these socio-technical innovation bundles and not only one innovation? That's my first question. And if it has been done, that would be good to see an example of that. And the other element that I have with the scaling scan is that this barrel figure, this analogy of the barrel, that's very famous for nutrient use efficiency. So that was the original idea of the barrel with different stakes. It was that you can add any amount of phosphorus if you or nitrogen if you want, but if phosphorus is limiting nutrient, your yield will not improve. So that's the von Liebig and von Liebscher theory, law of the optimum, law of the minimum. That's a very classic concepts in agronomy. And then if we go to the law of the minimum and law of the optimum, it sort of talks a little bit about substitutability of things. So in the scaling scan, you may have a poor finance ingredient, but a very strong public policy ingredient. So the relationship between the ingredients and the capability of one ingredient to compensate for the lack of another ingredient is not explicit in the scaling scan. And I think that needs to be explicit. So it's two things: the bundling, socio-technical innovation bundles. How do we take them with the scaling scan? And the compensation of different ingredients for scaling in the scaling scan. If you can tell us some reflections about that, I would appreciate.
Yes, thank you very much, Santiago, for these questions. I completely agree, first of all, that it is, especially about the second question, especially about the substitutability. For number one, for your first question, how to, address several of these innovation bundles, I would, with the scaling scan the way it is right now, I would very practically say I would do several scaling scans. And I would do it with several different stakeholders. So maybe have one scaling scan that you do with the stakeholders from sorry, I forget what your example was, but whatever, one group of stakeholders from one group and one group of but I'm sorry, I'm confusing myself. But if we go through, so I would do several scaling scans for the different parts that you have with different, thank you, Michael, milk cooperative. So I would do one scaling scan, for example, for the milk part, for the feeding part, with the stakeholders there. And then at the end, so I would do several ones, and then I would probably try to figure out, bring them together, see where the overlaps and divides are. And then I would bring everyone together. So all of these people that I talked about for all of these different groups, and kind of present these results from I think you could totally use the scaling scan. I think it would take a little while, and I think the scaling scan could be adjusted to work better with everything all together. So I think that's a really interesting question for the future, Santiago, for developing the scaling scan further. But I think that that's the way it is right now. I think that could totally work. Bring everyone together, have a big workshop, discuss all the different results of all the other scaling scans that you did, and figure out how you can work it together for the whole innovation bundles, for all of them together. Concerning the substitutability, I completely agree that that needs to be made explicit, because these are not hard. I mean, they can substitute to different extents for one another. However, I think the problem is that the scaling scan in itself is a generic tool, right? It's supposed to be applicable for everything, everywhere, at all times. And I think if you make things clear, I mean, I think it definitely needs something saying explicitly that these are also substitutable, the barrel. So maybe the barrel image needs to be worked on itself, or changed. But I think it would be really hard to have a generic tool that would allow for such super detail of like relatively small details like, oh, well, if we have more of this kind of public investment, then we'll need less of this kind of other factor here. Because I mean, the problem is with scaling in general, right, is that it's always context specific. And we can never, and and that's what makes it so hard, and that's what makes also having these generic tools and any kind of generic framework so hard, because they're always emergent properties, they're always context specific, they're always different, and that's why this is so very good point, Santiago, and thank you very much. I mean, very good 2 points. I will definitely take these into account as we move forwards with developing the scaling scan
Probably we can try
further.
to find a case study where we can push the
We can do
scaling
that.
scan towards multiple elements of a social technical innovation bundle
Yep.
and to see the sustainability and the complementarity, the synergies between the different things. But anyway, thanks very much.
Yes, no, thank you. We should definitely look for that.
With Santiago and Katarina, yeah, of course, I mean, no tool is complete, and you can always find ways on, get to their limits and say, oh, where's this and where's the other? Yeah? But no, that's very clear. Yeah, I just had a small comment on Jonathan, your question about the differences between concepts of scaling and adoption. I mean, I'm agricultural economist. For us, adoption happens usually at the farm, at the plot level. And what you refer here to scaling, we use the term diffusion. So we would talk about diffusion of innovations, but I guess in the concept of the scaling, that would mean scaling out and does not necessarily consider all these different dimensions. I just wanted to make that comment. I also have a question to you, Katarina, regarding the scaling scan. I mean, probably some innovations you don't need a scaling scan because they're so great, everyone wants them. You don't need it, right? I mean, maybe not in agriculture, but smartphones. I'm sure no one did really a scaling scan. They just happened to, everyone wanted one. They were crazy about them. And then other things you wouldn't want them to scale, right? Because yeah, you showed some examples. They're obviously really bad ideas, or you wouldn't want. Does the scaling scan also in early phases? I mean, Jelle made in his comment, and you talked about scaling readiness. Is there a way to assess? And I'm really ignorant about the tool. I've heard about it, but I've never used it. Is there a way to really assess? Okay, this is a promising technology or innovation that should be pushed forward. It doesn't scale for some other limitations that can be restricted, but the benefits or the expected benefits as such are like, is there some sort of ex ante assessment of the technology, the innovation itself that you want to scale? Thank you.
Well, sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. So thank you so much for that, Michael. And I think, I mean, when you talk about scaling, the cell phone is definitely a huge outlier that no, you do not need a scaling scan for the iPhone, right? It just, yeah, everybody, like you said, everybody wanted it. Um, yes, but in the third version of the scaling scan, there is a specific part, there is a specific list of questions or section of questions that you go through asking about these further future impacts, or that may be, positive but also negative. And that really asks you to consider these future, like different aspects of future impacts, be it environmental, social, financial, that the innovation may have. In scaling readiness, again, I believe scaling readiness is a lot more technologically focused. And I believe when you start out, it also, I don't I'm not so well versed in scaling this readiness. So maybe we should ask someone who is more trained in this one. But I believe that there's also some part there where you ask about how responsible is this innovation really going to be in the long term? And just a little point on that as well. I mean, people always, or one of the big arguments is that, oh, inclusive and responsible, or either one of them, that inclusive or responsible scaling is not it can't happen because it's so slow. It slows down the whole process. It's basically makes it unsustainable, right? Because we need to scale now. We need to address these questions now. But I think that's it's a false dichotomy to make, because I think that you can only scale sustainably in the long term if you are scaling inclusively and responsibly from the get-go. Because if our innovations aren't, socially, environmentally, financially adapted, then they're not going to be sustainable in the long term. And so this is an argument often made by people to say, oh, well, we can't have a big multi-stakeholder process now. We can't do this because it's going to take too much time, because we need to address this now. But again, I would say false dichotomy. And we need to have this inclusive and responsible scaling from the get-go, these ideas, to really have and long-lasting impact like we are trying to, or which is our aim, right? That was just
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I second Santiago's comment. It would be great to see this really like a full-fledged implementation. If you could accompany any project or intervention with this scan, like from the start, and really trying to implement that in a way it is thought. The textbook example, if you want, that Jonathan was asking for, if you could, try to implement it somewhere. No, but thank you very much. Are there further questions? Santiago posted a nice photo of some barrels there. I don't know if it's
those
whiskey
are wine barrels.
or wine. Yeah,
I would
we don't
assume.
know.
I would assume.
Could also be whiskey.
Could
Sieg
also
is
be
also
whiskey, true.
Oh, it's scaling
No.
barrels.
Scaling barrels. What comes inside? Whiskey, wine, milk, water, vinegar, rum. Anything could enter there. We don't. I see Sieg has also joined. Thank you very much, Sieg, being with us. Are there any more questions, colleagues? Comments? I hope you will all go and check out the scaling scan when you think about how to push your innovation. Sieg is here. Hi, Sieg. Good
Thank
morning.
you, Katrina. I'm sorry I could only come in for the end because of other meetings. So I would point out there's a scaling, it's about 4 years old now, but scaling scan cross-regional comparison for mechanization paper that was put out a while ago that when I first came in, I found was one of the more interesting kind of contributions to understanding, because it's multi-regional, so it kind of can look at comparisons across different contexts. And then it also was mechanization, which is an interesting example. So anyways, I'll try and find that paper if anyone remembers it. I'm sure Leonard was on it.
I know what paper you're talking about, Sieg. I can share it.
Yeah, so I think pointing people to the literature is helpful rather than just the tool. Anyways, just a thought. But I
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
appreciate your focus on inclusive scaling, because again, that's often it's somewhat mechanical sometimes and not and very private industry focused. So as we have always said, is public, private, and civil society. So it's great to see research that you're proposing coming in on the inclusive side, because we have to keep our eyes on that, because otherwise who does?
Yeah, and it's really
not-
important. I mean, scaling private goods is very different from scaling public goods. I think that is very, very, very clear. And we scale public goods right here at CIMMYT. So it's a very different approach than the iPhone that has been mentioned.
Right, and the iPhone, they didn't know at first if people would like it, and it turned out to
Yeah.
be addictive, but no one knew that. So it's I'm not sure the scaling scam would have. Yes, it's Yelly. Thanks. I knew there was a. Of course, it was you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Yelly.
Yella. Yes, that's the paper.
Greatly appreciated. I really recommend that to everyone. It's a great example of how we can work across disciplines, and it's a very transdisciplinary paper. Right, we'll keep on up the good work, Katrina and others. It's great to see. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank
you.
you. I don't see any more hands or comments in the chat. The paper is here. Yeah, you can all have a look. Thank you very much again, Katarina, for your
thank you.
time.
And please, may I say, anybody, please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, if you just want to talk about this someday. I am always available and happy to discuss further.
Thank you so much for this one. colleagues, the next Paula Kantor seminar will be in January. So this was the last session for 2025. And I think we'll have an external visitor, but that will be confirmed. So thanks to all. Have a nice Christmas break for those who I won't see before that. And yeah, thanks for joining and for your interest, for being with us, and all the best. Stay tuned. Bye
Thanks,
bye,
everyone.
guys.
Bye bye. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye bye.